Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this McKell Institute digital event series in conversation with Annika Smethurst. Can I begin as people come into the join the webinar? It's just sitting on 7:30, so we're expecting a few more to drift in. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're all on tonight? Myself, I'm on Wurundjeri land here in northern Melbourne, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who are joining us here tonight. This is another opportunity that we've got here at the McKell Institute for our friends and supporters to engage in a conversation about politics and policy and the issues and events that are shaping our community in ways that we probably never had imagined. We're very fortunate to be joined by Annika tonight to discuss her new book, this one, which is released just a short time ago. It's a biography of Scott Morrison, the first real biography of our Prime Minister. And it's both a fascinating, interesting and thought-provoking read as we think about who's leading our nation and what that means for us all as we head into really an election season that's not too far away. Annika, for those of you who aren't as familiar as we all are here in Melbourne, she's the state political editor with The Age, came down to Melbourne after an extensive career. I don't know exactly how many years it was, Annika, in the Federal Press Gallery, where she worked as the national political editor for both the Telegraph and the Herald Sun, and in the process won 2 Walkley Awards. So made a significant impact on the Press Gallery. We are obviously very fortunate to have her now as a state political editor for The Age here in Melbourne, commenting on the epicenter of policy and politics in Australia, really, which is where, it's all, if it's not happening in Melbourne, come on, where is it happening? So thanks very much for joining us, Annika, here tonight. And congratulations on the book. I might start with the sort of, what drove you to write the first big biography of Scott Morrison?
I would like to say it was some sort of, moment where I just thought this needs to happen. I quit my job at the Sunday Tally after notable raids on my house and a pretty big year, where I had to go to the High Court and a few other things. And I thought I wouldn't mind a little break from journalism. And within about 5 minutes, I had a call from a publisher saying, "You'll be bored, write me a book." So I always thought I'd like to, sit down and do something like that. But I love newspapers and I love the immediacy. I love the drive, the rush at the end of the day to fill all these blank pages. But there's something great about having time to sort of just get to know one topic. And we discussed a few different ideas, and it just seemed that there was a gap in this market. Like or loathe Scott Morrison, he is the Prime Minister. And previous Prime Ministers who have had, Malcolm Turnbull being the obvious example, a fair bit was known about him before he came in. He was a known, whether through the Republic movement or things like this. Even Bill Shorten, before he was leader, was known, through the union movement, and of course the mine disaster and other things that sort of he rose to prominence. Little bits were known about Scott Morrison, but he really wasn't known in the way that others had been. So it is very hard to write a biography about someone who's still alive. It was due in January, and if you finish the Scott Morrison story in January, it's really not as bad as it is at the moment. So luckily, I guess, for those that loathe him, I didn't hand it in on time, like all journalists, and it gave me a few more months and the story completely changed. And it was impossible. I wanted to cut it off so many times, but I just things kept happening. And I'd like to think I'll do an update after the election, but it was a challenging task writing about someone so young, contemporary, and whose, life in his early 50s is far from over. But I really enjoyed it. It was so different from the sort of just get copy in newspapers that I've done for the best part of 10 years. It was a lot of afternoons spent at the National Gallery in Canberra, just trawling over sort of historical, things from his past and his family's and ancestors' pasts, and it was really a wonderful process. I would do it again in a heartbeat if I wasn't working other jobs, which is the mistake I made.
It does have there is a lot of fascinating history in there that you clearly, it's very obvious that there was a lot of time spent trying to go back and understand where he had come from. There's obviously people may be familiar with his sort of First Fleet origin story, which does trots out every now and then, but the connections to throughout his family life, and I personally found it quite interesting to kind of see how that was traced back. I think where I want to really sort of dig in first is almost at the title, a bit that you sort of mentioned in the why you got here, is because we didn't really know who he was as a country. We had a sense, been on the TV, maybe people had seen him at a Operation Sovereign Borders press conference from time to time. They might have twigged that he'd been the treasurer at some point, but I don't think many people really knew who Scott Morrison was, and that's clearly evident in the title of the book, The Accidental Prime Minister. So in thinking about and trying to analyse his rise to power, his ascent to power, how much of that do you think was about? How much of it was a plan? How much of a plan do you think he had to get there, versus being, right place, right time?
I'm going to sit on the fence a bit with this one, but I think that's why the title really works, because so many people read it and go, there's nothing accidental about this. He plotted his way there. And there's definitely an element of that. I also think he was assisted, especially at the last election, by the fact he wasn't really known. A lot of people who fought within the coalition that fought Peter Dutton coming back as leader, or, successfully knocking off Turnbull, just thought they had no chance of winning under him because he is known, and he's very polarising. They thought Scott Morrison wasn't that known. And when you speak to Labor going into that election, and when they reflect on mistakes they made back in 2019, they said when they did focus groups, they actually had to almost teach people who Scott Morrison was before then characterising him. And if you've got to do that, it's a really hard way to campaign. You're like, this is who this is, and this is why you shouldn't like him. People will have to have those ideas in their head first, because a lot of people don't give that much time to politics. So I think it actually, they say everybody who arrives in Canberra wants to be Prime Minister, everyone in the lower house at least. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Some of them would be a bit naive to think that would be the case. But a lot of people there obviously, are ambitious and want to be on the front bench and would think that they'd make a good Prime Minister. So he was always in that category. And you speak to colleagues and they say from the moment he was here, I think Joe Hockey used to tell his colleagues he's the most dangerous person in politics in Australia. So people could see the ambition dripping off him. But, a lot of people are ambitious and they never get there. I think he positioned himself well. Yes, he was polarising with the immigration, sovereign borders. Yes, he did have the history with Tourism Australia, but he, in a different way to how Dutton did it, Dutton's very much, overtly on the right. Scott Morrison doesn't belong to either faction. A lot of people, he did start off in New South Wales moderate, and a lot of people would say, well, he's not that now, he's a Conservative, but he's definitely, the Conservatives don't own him. They don't think he's one of theirs. So he positioned himself perfectly in a Stephen Bradbury type way for the others to fall. And in this case, it was, Julie Bishop was seen as two to the left. You had Peter Dutton two to the right, and he came through the middle. He hadn't made a huge amount of enemies. Doesn't mean people didn't trust him though. People trusted him. A lot of his colleagues report that they definitely don't trust him. But I guess that was known. So the idea of it being an accident is almost, a question that I reflect on throughout the book. Nothing about him on his way through. No one who met him in earlier life said that guy's going to be Prime Minister. That's very different when you talk to people about Frydenberg and in many ways Christian Porter before this year, Bill Shorten, people like that they'd been spoken about in these sort of ways, or they'd been to certain universities. We've got a long track record of Rhodes Scholars coming in, and making their way to the Prime Ministership. So he was none of those things. In many ways, he was very mediocre. But I think that covers a lot of his ambition, and it's actually something that his opponents really struggle with, because they see him as this person who they don't think they need to worry about, and underestimating him is dangerous, I think, if you're going up against him. And it's exactly how he's got to where he's gotten, by being underestimated that whole time.
Yeah, that it was very clear in the description of his journey through the New South Wales Liberal Party that he arrived really without a base. He didn't, he got into the right place at the right time, only into Parliament because his opponent fell over. The prior pre-selected candidate fell over thanks to some well-timed dirt being thrown. So it's really that I find that he's got there and solidified himself through the dint of his own kind of planning on one hand, scheming on the other, but it's really worked for him. To what extent do you think that what got him there can help keep him there? There's certainly, it's one thing to achieve the biggest job in the land, and we've all seen people who've spent a long part of their lives trying to become Prime Minister only to get there and suddenly find out it's actually quite a difficult job. How well do you think he's going to, the things that got him there, how well do you think they're going to keep him there?
Look, I would never have a guess about who's going to win the next election, because I've made those predictions incorrectly before. I think when you look at him now, people think he's in real strife, and there's no doubt about that. But reflecting on those things that got him there are the things that people need to worry about. So one of them I would say, is the fact he doesn't have an ideology, which a lot of people in Canberra and in political circles see as a really bad thing. It's how we see people. And in many ways, some of the great friendships of Canberra are people from the polar left and the right, but it's because they understand where people sit. They know what they represent. There's no point trying to convince them. So then you can, begin negotiations from there. The great problem with Scott Morrison is he doesn't seem to have this. I spoke to many of his colleagues that said the only time they've seen him really revved up on a policy issue was being anti-same-sex marriage. Other than that, he seems quite adaptable. Now, in Canberra, this is met with so much sort of cynicism and skepticism. It's because people can't place him, and they hate that. I think as a political strategy, it actually works for him because he's quite adaptable. You saw throughout COVID, they handed out a fair bit of money that some more conservatives in the Liberal Party wouldn't have been able to do, whether because of their own base or their own conservative backing wouldn't have sort of allowed them to do. It means he's not beholden to anyone. And I would say most voters in Australia don't put themselves, yes, there's people that align with Labor and Liberal Party, but within that, not everybody's like, well, I sit on, the right of the Labor Party or the left of the Liberal Party or things like this. So I think it's seen as a negative in Canberra, but I actually think it's made him a more adaptable, and some would say populist, pragmatic Prime Minister. He's all about winning. And when you're not sort of worried about climate change or knighting Prince Philip or these things that for whatever reason you've decided that you need to do because it's part of you, I think it as a political strategy, and it might be a reflection on where we are in politics, and we can discuss if that's a bad thing, but practically it works. And I think that is something that will help him. I also think the underestimation is another thing that did help get him there, and it's going to help keep him there if he does win. His opponents overplay his missteps. I don't hold the hose, mate, was a stupid thing to say. I had to ask Jenny about the rape and things like this. They're stupid. They're clunky. I don't know if they swing elections. People who get upset about them were never probably going to vote for him in the first place. A lot of punters don't give as much time as I do to politics every day. It's often said they sort of give 2.5 minutes in the news at night watching it. So one of his colleagues said this beautiful quote to me, that opinion is like wet cement and it swirls around and around and around. And it's only when you consistently get these sort of patterns, which is the territory he's getting into now, and it sets against him, then he's sort of stuffed. But I think if you look at the last election, it helped him that people didn't know this, and that his opponents constantly think, I've gotcha because you did this. And I think he knows that it's stuff the chatty class like us talk about on Twitter or things like this, but isn't, they're not necessarily discussed around the dinner tables of Australia.
That's right. I mean, having spent quite a long time talking to a lot of people about what happened in 2019, I think it was very clear that the Labor Party had no handle on Morrison. They didn't know the campaign, didn't know who he was. They didn't know what his weaknesses were. And they were fighting a campaign against a prime minister who wasn't there anymore, and an election that wasn't, they were fighting a different election. What will be interesting, I think, as we get into I want to get into sort of what might happen next a bit later, but one of the things that struck me, and you sort of reflected on this, that he wasn't really passionate about anything except maybe same-sex marriage, and you sort of retell that story in the book, which I think is interesting, and people should go and sort of, I think it is indicative of the sort of where that fire and passion is in his inner core, but that it really doesn't manifest itself in his prime ministership much at all, or in his policy direction much at all. I know that there are a lot of people who get, to be honest, quite worked up about his sort of religious beliefs. Strikes me that it's probably one of the more unremarkable things about him and the way he does the job. Just wouldn't mind you sort of reflecting on how you think the sort of perceptions of his and his faith play in politics.
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts on that. I do think it does sit uncomfortably for some people, because a lot of us, and even those that did grow up with Christianity in our lives, it was Easter or being dragged there on to Sunday school as a kid to an Anglican church or a Catholic church, and it wasn't the Pentecostalism we see from him. Like it or loathe it, I think it's probably the most genuine thing about him. People I spoke to who he went to school with said he would pray before rugby games. His family were deeply involved in the church. They weren't Pentecostal. That's something that that he developed, but their whole community centered around the church. So I do think, again, it's something his opponents overplay. And Labor will say this, that during the election and that Easter weekend, and let's not forget Bill Shorten went to a church that weekend in Queensland too. Not much was made of it. He went to what we would call a pretty boring church. Scott Morrison didn't. He invited the cameras in, and the hand waving and those sort of images we'll remember. Labor at the time thought it was a misstep, and thought people are not going to like this. And in hindsight, when you talk to them, they'll sort of say, actually, probably we underestimated that. And if you look at the results of the election, he did quite well in seats with highly religious groups. Now, they're not necessarily Christians, high group, rates of Hindus and things like this. And it was seen as that he would protect their religion. He really was able to frame it in a, I will look after your rights. And that's something a narrative he got up through the same-sex marriage debate. I find it interesting. He said in his maiden speech that he doesn't see the Bible as a policy handbook. I don't think he did outside of same-sex marriage. And it's interesting, the people that called for him to show more Christian compassion with refugees were often the same people that when he showed his religion during the same-sex marriage debate said, don't show it now. So no one's perfect in this space. I think with this same-sex marriage thing, the problem really was that Cook, his own electorate, voted for it overwhelmingly or quite strongly, and he couldn't bring himself to vote for it and worked pretty hard internally against it. And there's a bit in Malcolm Turnbull's book where he says that on the flight home after the yes vote, Scott Morrison reflected and said, I don't know my country anymore, and was really actually deeply hurt about that. So I think it does show a weakness in him. I don't think he uses his religion deliberately to gain votes. I think that's a consequence of it. Yeah. But I think it does change his framing of how he sees the country. And, I'm not saying we're a country of atheists at all. I don't think that's the case. But I think he misrepresents his own upbringing and how much of a role religion played in that, and how that perhaps reflects modern Australia.
Interesting. One of the things I've got written here is, as I was reading the book, and it reflects a little bit on this, what's his reason for being there? Like, what does he want to do as Prime Minister? Which I think is in many respects, if we hadn't had the pandemic, he'd be in he would have had to answer that question by now. What sense, doing the research that you did and talking to the people you talked to, what do you think he wants to do with the office of Prime Minister?
I think this is a big problem. Again, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, we knew where Tony Abbott sat and we knew the sort of country he wanted Australia to be. Same with Malcolm Turnbull. And I think after two quite polarising Liberal Prime Ministers, this is different. A lot of people, and I spoke to somebody from the New South Wales right who's overtly right and conservative, and said to me, if you put your hand through him, he's just like, there's nothing there. It's like he's a reflection, he's a mirage. And they said, it's all okay not to believe in anything and be pragmatic until, well, one, your enemies start coming for you and you don't have a faction to help you. But two, if you face a really difficult policy decision, and then you go back to your guiding principles and you know what you're there for and you know what you believe in. He doesn't have it in that same way. And, politics, we all like to think there's an easy solution to every policy. There's a right and a wrong way, but there isn't, and you see it in Canberra. There's a lot of negotiation. There's a lot of different views within parties. It's hard to really navigate difficult policy decisions if you don't have that. I don't know what he wants to achieve. A lot of his colleagues don't know what he wants to achieve. He talks about values a lot, how he sees Australia, but not, any great sort of policy idea. Now, when I speak to people in the department around Canberra, public servants, they say he's actually quite good at the detail of policy. He's engaging, he sits down and, he comes up with ideas and is one of these get the butcher's paper out and write down all the silly ideas you've ever had. That might be good at harvesting and sort of leading policy debates, but I don't think he has a great steer on what he wants to do. And as you say, I dare say, I don't want to call it a gift, COVID, but it has given him something to sort of handle. You can't just go from crisis to crisis if you want to be a long-term Prime Minister. I think if you look back to Howard, who he often puts up on a pedestal in that way, he had a vision, he had a bit more of an ideology of where he wanted to go. And I think we will see Morrison struggle with that after the pandemic.
Yeah, we've had a question in the chat, and I had this, my note here is Hawaii versus Hawke's Nest, which was kind of my shorthand for how people compare John Howard and Scott Morrison a lot. And Morrison obviously is trying to draw that comparison out himself. He wants to be Howard's heir in the Liberal Party very clearly and achieve that kind of relaxed and comfortable relationship with the vast majority of the Australian community. But Howard did have a bit more of an overtly burning ideological position on things and took really his big calculated risk very early in his prime ministership. And the first of his two big calculated risks being the GST. And it, in many respects, was something that, he was forged in the fire of politically and with the Australian community. I worry from the position of Scott Morrison, not that as a position of someone who would probably prefer to see someone else as the Prime Minister, that he doesn't have that at this point. And it will be interesting to see what the framing is, or the program that he articulates as being sort of his plan for post-pandemic Australia, which I don't know that we've got any kind of sense of. I don't know if you've...
Yeah, I can understand why he frames himself on Howard. The two Liberal Prime Ministers in between, he wanted to set a sort of different tone from the Abbott Turnbull years. He does idolise John Howard. We had Howard Spatlers, we had his Quiet Australians. I think the difference is John Howard was a little bit more authentic. Now, when I looked at this, I looked at, how true is Scotty from marketing? How true is the daggy dad? I think he's very good at looking at things in his past, this is Scott Morrison, and things about him and ramping them up. When you ask people about the daggy dad thing, they seem to say that there are elements. He is actually happy at a Tina Arena concert more than at the Opera House or something like this. does love his kids, but everyone loves their kids. You know, he isn't particularly highbrow, but he knows so well the bits of himself that he should ramp up. You know, he is actually really political and is really in the political bubble, but he turns that down and says, this is all something you only care about in Canberra. I'm just a dad from the Shire. So he's very smart at knowing he wasn't going to do something silly and try and reinvent himself and be someone he's not, because we've seen that fail with the new Julia starts today, or the sort of these things. I think he was smart enough to say, I'm going to try and be like Howard, and these are the things that work. He plays up the fact he went to a public school. He went to Sydney Boys High. They've had 3 prime ministers. It's hardly battler territory. But he's very good at that. I think Howard was more genuine. You know, he actually did go to a public school and his parents were small business owners and things like this. So it probably came more naturally for John Howard. I think Scott Morrison has to work harder at being that person. I do sort of, I take your point. I don't know, you know, what he does believe in. And as I've sort of said in the past, I think that is handy, but in some ways it does make you more adaptable, but it's going to be a problem for him long term. You know, if he does want to stay there 11 years or something like this, or be sort of Howard-esque, I think in many ways he might run out of things to do. Howard did have a vision. A lot of Scott Morrison's decisions are based on tabloid newspapers. They called him the tabloid treasurer. Now, that's not altogether stupid. People do bag that out, but, you know, newspapers do reflect often, you know, they want to sell copy at the end of the day. I have worked for a Melbourne tabloid, and when Collingwood were on the front, we sold more papers. Like, you know, it's a good way to see, listen to talk back what people want. I think the problem is for him that he doesn't really, you know, sometimes you actually have to say, no, look at Howard with the guns and things like this. You know, he was under immense pressure, but he went a way that he knew was right. And Scott Morrison's very bad at making decisions without data, without newspaper editors behind him, without editorials. And sometimes you're going to come up against those really difficult decisions and you've just got to do them regardless of that. And he's not that great at that.
Just reflecting a little bit on in the context of that conversation, and then thinking about the next election. So we don't really know why he's there or what he can do. He'll have some policies, and this concept of the cement you talked about earlier, that, you know, if it keeps moving, you don't know what it is, nothing sets. How much do you think and one of the things that I think the Labor Party hopes is setting a little bit is this concept of accepting responsibility, owning a problem. You know, the I don't hold a hose is a bad, clunky line, but it spoke to potentially has the potential to speak to a pattern. Do you think he's going to, do you think any of that kind of timing the job, repeat exposure, is going to open up some weaknesses for him? Or do you think he's got the political skills to pivot away from that and own up and get over it?
A little bit of both. Look, I think that line is better than the women's line. If you think that he will lose an election on people thinking he's bad with women, I don't think he is. I think he is. I think he has troubles with some women, but I don't think it's enough. You know, he didn't have a reputation around Canberra of being the sleazy guy in the bar, you know, like some of people on both sides of politics and senior positions. So he's married his high school sweetheart. He said stupid stuff, and his government has been obviously in turmoil over this. But I think if his opponents overestimate how much that issue could swing an election, I think what you're talking about, the collective sort of not my responsibility, Christian Porter doesn't work for me, he works for the people of Pierce, I don't hold the hose, mate, I didn't order, you know, it wasn't me who ordered the Pfizer, go ask Greg, these sort of things, I think they're problematic. And as you say, it's accumulative. I think one off, the I don't hold the hose thing was bad, and the whole bushfires thing was a catastrophe for him. He bounced back from that. We saw that. You know, everyone sort of said this is the end of his prime ministership, and it wasn't. So I think it's when there's repeated patterns of behaviour, and the blame shifting is problematic. And I actually think that is a stronger line, especially when we're in a crisis. And what we know in crises is that people stick with incumbents because they feel safe. And if people start to get a sense that, no, he does make mistakes that aren't going to make me safe, I think that is problematic and is going to be far more effective than, some of the other lines that people have tried with him.
Just a couple sort of concluding questions. We've talked a little bit, you've talked quite a lot about the sort of positioning out of the pandemic. I suppose there's two questions that sit at the heart of that, of what comes next, is when the election's going to be and what it's going to be about. And a little bit they're intertwined, because he'll get to decide the timing and he'll get to use the resources of the government to try and set an agenda. What are you reading what you've read, knowing what you've known, talking who you've talked to? What do you think what do you think he'll be thinking about when he decides when he wants to go to an election and what he wants that election to be about?
I think the one thing we underestimate when we talk about the federal election now is how much things change. You look at last year, if you weren't in Victoria, I'm in Victoria now, but life went on in many states last year, and it's a very different position now. But people's mindset changes quite quickly. And if you talk to campaigners, they talk about people not liking to remember trauma. So it seems impossible now, while a lot of us are locked down in our houses and the vaccine rollout has been disastrous and all these other things, that people could possibly forget these things. March, May, whenever it is, and I think it will be one of those, is a long way away. And if we all have the summer that he anticipates, with borders open, families reunited, high vaccination rates, going to the cricket, going to the tennis, people will forget these times because we all want to. I don't want to remember these times. So I think that will work to his advantage. And as you say, as Prime Minister, he actually gets to make that decision about when we go to the polls. So unless something happens before, like a member of his, one of his members quits. So I that's why I don't think it's a, fait accompli, even though he's down in the polls, that he's going to lose. I actually think he's also a master, and this is something Labor underestimated at the last election, in political strategy. Scotty from marketing, you can sort of say how many mistakes or triumphs he's had in his career before he came into politics in that area. But one thing he does know is backroom politics, and a lot's made about people on both sides that come up through the party machine, but it is an apprenticeship, and it does make you understand how these things work. Targeting seats, those sort of things. Malcolm Turnbull was terrible on the campaign trail. I went on the campaign trail with him. He wasn't very good. So, I do think he comes in with a bit of an advantage there. He will sell it as recovering economy. And we know deep down, regardless of data and everything else, when the coalition talk about this, it works for them. So, talking about jobs, talking about recovery, I actually think in a space where we're in with low case numbers next year, hopefully, I think it could actually be a real advantage to him. Doesn't mean that he doesn't have enough to talk about because he doesn't have any policies. That could be problematic. But he is, a Conservative Prime Minister. The whole shtick of the Conservative Party is not to do too much change. So I think I think that's where they'll go. I think they will have problems trying to sell that message given where the economy is at. But they do have a great big excuse with COVID. And I think most people would be happy that JobKeeper and these programs kept people afloat. So I think if he goes to an election before January, he might be in a little bit of strife. If he goes after January, I think it's back to an even playing field.
Yeah, I think it's very astute analysis. Last thing I want to ask, just because we've had a couple of questions about the book process itself. How much, you obviously spoke to a lot of people. How much did the Prime Minister himself engage with you and the book?
Look, I'll give him one thing. I'd heard a tale about Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull when a book was being written about him, another unauthorised biography, who he deliberately ran interference. And he also was made sure he did a lot of media interviews the week it came out so that it didn't sort of get the hype around it. Scott Morrison's a pragmatist. I tried not to tell him to start with, and I tried to ring a lot of people. Someone dobbed me in eventually. I'm not sure who it was, but I have my suspicions. And eventually I rang his office and said, I'm writing this book. And they said, we know, this number of emails have come in. They let me interview him a few times. I didn't really ask him about the modern stuff as much. A lot of it's on the public record. I'd asked him at press conferences and things like this, and I got to talk to his colleagues. I wanted to know about sort of the things we don't see, the early Scott Morrison in the limited time I had with him. I think I did 3 interviews. He also was smart enough to know that the squeaky wheel is always going to, be the one that gets the oil and the loudest. So instead of just letting me speak to people in his past who he's made enemies of, and there were many, he sent people my way who had had good interactions with him. I had random phone calls from friends and family of his. I think that's fair. I'm a journalist. I can take information with a grain of salt, and I didn't want to just write a book that was overall critical. We're all sums of our experience in our life, and we have good and bad and shades of grey. So I think it shows his pragmatism is exactly what it does, which I hope in the book I get that across about how pragmatic he is. And
Absolutely.
The way he dealt with me was exactly that. He knew he couldn't fight it, so he thought, well, I'm going to lean in and try and spin this the best I can.
Absolutely. I think his pragmatism shines through absolutely loud and clear, which, he got to be Prime Minister and he won an election, and that just demonstrates that political skill. And it's going to be an interesting election next year, as I think it will be, that I think none of us really know what it's going to fundamentally be about yet. And that's what's going to make politics and policy over the next 6 months so interesting. Annika, congratulations again on the book.
Thank you.
For those who are on the call and haven't yet read it, please go out and do it. There's a link in the chat, but it's available at all. And there it is there. I've got mine here. It's available at all good bookstores. Make sure you support your local booksellers. Some of them are doing amazing jobs at making sure that we're all well read during this pandemic, and they deserve every dollar that we can sling their way. So please go and buy this book at your local independent bookseller. Thanks again, Annika. We really appreciate the time you've taken tonight. And thanks to everyone who's joined us. And we'll have a recording of this available to our contacts. And make sure you've signed up to our email list to be kept abreast of the next in our McKell Institute Digital Events series. We've got a couple of really interesting discussions coming up in coming weeks. So we'll be alerting our members and supporters to those. Thanks very much for joining us, Annika. Thank you. See you all later.